This video will walk through the NetApp deployment engine process to create our HCI cluster. The first thing we need to do is we need to determine one of the storage nodes' bond 1G gigabit management address. To do this, we can log into the IPMI of that particular node, and then from here we can see from the console the IP address for the bond 1G. If this was DHCP, we may already know it from the DHCP server, or if this was a temporary IP we assigned, we may already know this. But this is a way we can come in and see it. We launch the console, and we'll be able to see what that 1 gig address is. We don't have to use storage node A. This can actually be any of the storage nodes, as NDE is loaded on all of them. So now that we know our address, we would go ahead and log back in. If this is the first time, the address itself will redirect us to the NDE site. If you've logged into it before, you actually need to use the 442 and the NDE /. From here, we'll accept the prerequisites. We'll make sure the customer understands and acknowledges the end user license agreement for both NetApp and for VMware. On the next page, it'll ask whether or not we're deploying NetApp ONTAP Select. It's automatically deployed as part of the workflow if needed. Then it's going to ask which version of vCenter we're doing. In this case, we're using 6.5U2. We'll need to have the fully qualified domain name of our vCenter. This is a best practice in installing vCenter. We'll need to know our DNS server. So this A record needs to exist in that DNS server before we actually deploy. On the next page, we'll choose our credentials that'll be used for all of our accounts that get created. This is across NetApp and VMware. You'll see the password complexity requirements listed on the screen. We'll put our password in, we'll confirm our password, and then we'll move on to the next step. From here, we can choose our network topology. For our compute nodes with 1.4, we now have 6 cable configurations as well as 2 cable configurations. It's going to look at the hardware and actually present the most appropriate one based on what we have. For the 6 cable option, we can choose to use standard switches or vSphere distributed switches. Storage nodes use the 4 cable topology regardless. In the next step, we can now see the nodes that are ready for deployment. We need a minimum of 4 storage nodes and 2 compute nodes. In order to deploy NetApp HCI, we can choose as many as we want above and beyond that. In this case, we're only going to do 2 compute nodes, so we can do a cluster expansion later. On the Network Settings tab, we're going to continue filling out some of the network information, so additional DNS and NTP servers, and we'll use the easy network form. From here, we can do a naming prefix for all of our elements, so this is just that prefix that it'll use for our hosts and our storage. It is recommended to say no for VLAN ID assignment at this point. This allows us to specify VLAN IDs in the following page, but makes it easy for network validation. So always choose no at this step. We now enter our subnet, gateway, and starting IP address information for each of the 3 types of networks. We have our management network, which would be our ESXi host management IP addresses, as well as our virtual machine IP addresses. We have our vMotion network, which is used for vSphere vMotion. Usually that's not routed. And then we have our storage iSCSI network. This would be for the storage traffic. Again, this would normally not be routed. We enter in these values, and when we're done, we say apply network settings, which this then rolls out to the first page we are on. It will overwrite anything that was inputted on that first page. From here, we can see network live validation in use, and that it's actually checking to make sure that these values are available. This process can take a couple minutes to do, as it is checking everything. So you would not want to start changing any of these values or moving on to the next page until everything has green check marks. Once we have everything validated, we can now actually add our VLAN tags if needed. So from here, we can scroll up to the appropriate network, which in most cases will just be the vMotion network, and we can add our VLAN tag. Doing this actually turns off the network validation, which is why we want to do that first. And if we had chosen yes at the first easy settings wizard, we would have actually had to have put VLAN IDs in for everything. So by putting no and then adding the VLAN at this point makes things quicker. We click continue, and on the next step we can review all of our settings, and then when we say start deployment, we can first copy the new address that we'll be using for the NDE to the clipboard just in case we get disconnected. The deployment process starts. This will take about 45 minutes to an hour, and during the deployment it will switch over to that permanent IP address. We copied it to the clipboard in case we need it, but it does do the automatic redirection for you that first time. From here we just monitor the status. It'll go through configuring the network, setting up the storage, and then setting up the ESXi hosts. At times during the process you may need to refresh your screen for the NDE workflow to continue reporting. As we go through this process, it'll set up the ESXi hosts and then configure vCenter and the management nodes. Once completed, we can then actually export all of our configuration to a CSV file using the link underneath the overall progress indicator. This allows us to capture some of those final networking values that we can use for our post-deployment documentation. Once completed, we can then click the Launch vSphere client, which will actually go in and load our vCenter server. From here, we can log into our vCenter server and see some of the final pieces. We'll log in using the credentials that we created during the NDE. The SSO environment is vSphere.local, so administrator at vSphere.local using the password that was created. Once logged in, we can see our new vSphere environment has been created, including our vSphere data center, our individual cluster, and then our hosts and virtual machine appliances, which right now is just the vCenter and the management node appliance. We can see things are running. And then if we go to the home menu, we can actually take a look at the plugins that the management node installed. The element configuration plugin allows you to do basic cluster administration. From the clusters menu, we can see that our cluster has already been added, and we can see that the storage is currently in an online state. We can use this plugin to do things like cluster expansions, which we will cover in a later video.